What's up, guys? Pete here. How's it going? Today we're moving on to episode number 2 of the series that I started with you guys last week, which was basically the idea being that we're going to go through the whole topic of No Limit Hold'em 6 Max Cash in relation to my book, and we're going to be going through chapter by chapter, not like actually reciting the book to you because that would be kind of boring and would defeat the whole point of me like selling the book in the first place if I was just going to give it away for free, but kind of showing you guys what to expect in the book for a way for me to sort of begin the process of publicity, because I expect it to be out in the next couple of months, but also just for to give us a really nice sort of formulaic roadmap for going through this really fiendishly complicated massive game where there's just so much to talk about. It won't be like one episode per chapter because the chapters are a bit too dense. The book's going to be like 600 pages or something. It's going to be the absolute Bible textbook for No Limit Hold'em 6 Max Cash, I hope. So there's a lot to get through following this book through from start to finish. Last week we talked about opening ranges and how to rate starting hands and therefore, form standard opening ranges against your population, how to adjust those for different kind of exploitative conditions being apparent at the table. This week we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about opening specifically with reference to stealing from the button, the small blind, the cutoff, that kind of thing. But I'm mainly going to be using the button as our kind of model spot today. And I want to talk a bit about why it's really important to steal wide. I'll begin with that actually. It's really important to steal wide because, well, what are we doing when we steal? We're trying to replace the money that we naturally lose when we're in the blinds. It's not free for us to sit at the poker table. We do have to actually generate a constant flow of money in small and common spots to help our red line get better, our non-showdown line, and help negate a lot of the damage that's done by us basically having to just be dealt 5 deuce off and fold in the blinds and things like that. So button stealing is not a luxury. It's not something you do if you feel like being really aggro and like putting pressure on people or anything like that. We don't steal the button to put people to the test and whatever, or even to abuse our position. We steal the button because more fundamentally we have to live, to survive. It's like eating in life. You don't eat just for fun because you want to be aggressive. You eat because you'll die if you don't. And online poker is the same. If you're not stealing the button wide, you'll die. Like, you won't be able to sustain all the red line losses. So the format for today's podcast, we're going to start by introducing what I call raw RFE, which stands for raw required fold equity, or RRFE, if you like. It's the central notion that I introduced really early in the book, and it comes up time and time again. And what RFE is, required fold equity, is a target. It's a benchmark. And raw RFE is the amount of folds you would need to be getting, the percentage of fold equity you would need in order for a steal to break even, basically, if you had absolutely no prospect post-flopper or no equity whatsoever, which is never the case. So we're going to start with raw RFE, talk about how to figure that out, and then we're going to move on to adjusted RFE, or ARFE, which is what you're going to be using as your target when you've actually taken into account the fact that you have equity in the hand, the fact that you're not just playing 2 completely meaningless cards and planning on folding every single flop if called. Oh no, he called me. Guess I'll just open fold the flop. Some fish do that. We play better strategies than those fish, so we are not going to be doing that. Otherwise, having a poker podcast and me offering private coaching would be a little bit silly if I was going to recommend that kind of strategy. So the fact that we're not doing that and we are playing better than that after the flop gives us other routes to EV in branches where our opponent doesn't fold. So in the EV tree, he can fold pre or he can not fold pre through our steal. When he folds pre, that's great. We realize all that fold equity right away. If we don't quite get all of our fold equity from pre-flop folds, that's okay, as long as we play post-flop semi-competently and play some strategy, like I say, that's better than just open folding every flop. That's going to decrease RFE further, and we're going to get to that when we talk about adjusting RFE. Then I'm going to talk about steal factors, like what table conditions should make you more or less inclined to steal wider, and how do those affect your RFE target and whether you meet it. Then we're going to talk a little bit about long-term EV versus short-term EV, which is basically the idea that while it may be plus EV to steal in a vacuum in one hand in isolation, if you were to steal 100% of hands and therefore open that 6 deuce off, that might be a bad long-term strategy that would cost you future fold equity. So fold equity is not just confined to in a vacuum. We're not playing every hand in a vacuum. We're generating numbers on our HUD which are going into our opponent's data that are affecting the way they exploit us in future, and therefore we need to be conscious about what RFE is actually doing to our and what that's actually doing to our whether we meet our RFE or not. Like how likely are we to meet our target in future if we create a certain image for ourselves now. So that's the roadmap. Let's get into it by starting with raw required fold equity, raw RFE. So every time I open the button, there's a target that I need to make, theoretically ignoring all the post-flop goodies that are actually going to be going on in reality when we adjust RFE. So let's start with a 3x and see what that looks like. Well, first of all, how do we calculate it out of game? Out of game, what you need to be doing is actually doing this mathematically to find the exact target of fold equity that you would need to break even on a steal. Again, ignoring all the goodies that go on post flop and realizing equity. We'll get to that in a minute. So raw RFE in a model where we open 3x on the button and there are no antes in play because we're not in a deep game is 3, which is our risk, right? We want to do risk divided by risk plus reward. So basically risk divided by that risk again plus the amount we're trying to win from the pot that's already in there, that's not coming from our stack. So we do 3 divided by 3 plus 1.5. One big blind is 1, one small blind is 0.5. These are all in big blinds. So we do 3 divided by 4.5. Again, add before you divide. Now there are brackets around that. You add the latter part. You're not doing 3 divided by 1, then adding on the 3 again. You're doing 3 divided by 1.5 plus 3. Sorry, 1.5, not 1. So that gives you an RFE of 66%. So that means that when you open 3x in the button with no antes in play, in a game that doesn't rake, just opens and blinds, which no real game that you have a chance of beating should, your RFE will be 66%. That's to say that raw RFE wise, if your opponents fold 2/3 of the time, you are making a profit before you even think about things like the amount of equity that you have in the hand, or ability to see better, or outplay your opponent, or value better, get implied odds post flop, or whatever, or the fact that you have pocket kings. So that's how you work that out. Out of game, that's fine. In game, you're probably not going to want to. There are lots of other situations that are really quite recurring and common where you're going to be using this notion of RFE as well. Post flop, particularly, and sometimes you'll be making a bet of like 17 into 32, and you don't actually know what percentage of the time that needs to work off the top of your head. You don't really have time if you're playing fast tables or multi-tabling to whip out a calculator and do the calculation without like timing out on lots of other tables and stuff. So what you're going to do is refer quickly to your mental archive of milestone RFE points. A pot size bet will need to work 50% of the time before adjustment for you to break even on that bluff, assuming that it is a bluff and you're not ever getting called by a worse hand or getting to showdown and winning. And then a half pot size bet will need to work 1/3 of the time, 33%. Knowing those two milestones allows you to estimate everything in between, basically. There's a table that I put in my book that has like 7 or 8 of these milestones broken down, but if you're one of these people that doesn't like just sort of parrot fashion memory, you might want to actually just commit pot size and half pot size to your sort of milestone table, mental bank, so that you can just estimate everything in between. Like, okay, this time I bet 21 into a pot of 30, that's just over 2/3 pot, which is going to be somewhere almost exactly in between half and pot size, a little bit less, so I'm going to need around 28-29% fold equity. So that's how we work out raw RFE both in-game and out of game. Like I say though, we need to adjust this. It's not enough for us just to use raw RFE, because in reality, that's never actually the case. In reality, we're usually getting called pre-flop there when we 3x more often than we're getting 3-bet, thankfully. And that means that we're going to be able to see the flop most of the time that our opponent doesn't fold. So when our opponent does continue in that branch, there's another branching where we split the tree between the times he calls and times he 3-bets. Times we 3-bets, we're probably folding, because if we're using a pure steal, we're like down at the bottom of our range, we're probably folding to that. If we have a stronger hand in our range, then we don't really need to think of this in an RFE context anyway, because we're kind of opening the hand more for value, and there are other reasons going, not just the steal. So that's basically what it comes down to. We need to adjust our RFE. How do we do that? Well, we adjust our RFE based on how likely we are to see the flop for a start. Well, there's a bunch of factors that allow you to do this, basically. The first one is going to be that you're going to get closer, I guess, or you're going to move further away from RFE. The situation's going to be more better for you, basically, more favorable for you than RFE suggests, as these factors are true, basically. So basically, you're looking for hands that have flop ability. So you want a hand that can actually connect with flops. Like opening Jack 8 suited is going to be much better than opening 5-4 off. Jack 8 suited can flop more top pairs, medium pairs, second pairs, draws. Well, not more draws maybe, but well, flush draws. 5-4 off certainly can't do that. It's just a much better hand. And therefore, when you're adjusting RFE there, my rule is normally adjust RFE by 10 or 15% based on these factors. And you're going to be more near the upper end of that, the 15%, when you have a hand like Jack 8, and more down towards the sort of 10% when you have a hand like 5-4 off. Basically, 5-4 off is far from useless. It can flop trips and boats and quads, but it's not a hand that's going to flop well as frequently as Jack 8 suited. So this notion of frequent strength, how often a hand connects well with the flop, how floppable that hand is, if you like, is a very key notion when it comes to adjusting your RFE. The better your hand, the more you can adjust RFE by to lower that goal to allow you to make lighter vacuum plus EV steals. Secondly, it depends how tight the 3-betters are ahead or how light they are. If we have tight 3-betters ahead of us, that's really great because it means that even if we're lacking raw RFE because our opponents don't quite fold enough, it still means that we can make a profitable button steal because we're not getting 3-bet. So again, we're going to be able to adjust RFE by the maximum. We're going to be able to deduct 15% from that target fold equity because when they do continue, we get to see our equity almost all the time. We get to realize that. We get to play the flop all the time. We're not being forced to fold that pre-flop. Again, like I said in the last podcast last week, getting 3-bet is much worse than getting called when it comes to opening pre and then having to deal with what happens when your opponent doesn't fold. Post-flop fold equity is really central. The more fit or fold your opponent is, the higher EV a hand is going to be to open pre-flop. If you know your C-bets are likely to be really successful and have like 65% fold equity on lots of flops, then you can really happily just go to C-bet town, and that means that pre-flop the EV is higher of the open. Again means that you need to adjust RFE by a lot more. If someone's super fit or fold, you can even break that 10 to 15% rule and adjust it by like 20, 25%. Then you're getting into the realms where you just know it's plus EV to open any two cards, at least in a vacuum. How aware the villains are is going to matter. I'll come back to that actually. Let's talk about how skilled they are first of all. If they're skilled, it just means that post-flop it's going to be difficult for you to get edges on them and find, exploit them and outplay them and things like that. Even with position, you'll still have an edge with position unless they're much better than you. But if they're decent opponents, you don't have a big skill edge or a skill edge at all. That's just going to limit how much you can deduct from the RFE target when you're making it open. If villains are unskilled, then the guy in the big blind is not 3-betting you much. He's 54-12. He plays horrendously after the flop. You can probably open close to any two cards, at least anything with a decent amount of playability if that guy is fit or fold. If the guy is more of the maniac kind of fish that's going to min raise your C-bets, randomly dunk pot at you for 3 streets, then you need more frequent strength. You need bigger cards, more playable cards, suited cards, cards that you're happy actually facing aggression with kind of more often. 4 deuce off is fine if all you need to do is meet a very easy RFE target and you're not bothered about the long-term effects of opening that hand, but it's not fine if you're against a player who's just not going to be giving you any fold equity after the flop. Then I mentioned villains being aware. That's a bit different to being skilled. An aware villain is more one who's not only skilled, they usually are always skilled, that's a necessary precursor for them being aware, but usually they're actually able to pick up on patterns, look at how wide you're opening, and then adjust their play accordingly. They're not going to be playing totally robotically against your opens. So when you go ahead and open a hand like 5-3 off, what you're doing is sending a message. They see that at showdown. That's one way they can find out you're doing it. You're sending a message that you're opening basically 100% of buttons against them, and they know they can up the 3-betting, be really polar with their 3-betting, just bluff the shit out of you, and you're not going to be able to do much about it because your range is just really weak. And they're going to be able to just outplay you basically and take advantage of the fact that you're playing a suboptimal pre-flop strategy against them, i.e. one that's very exploitable. You're opening too wide in the button when there's 2 players that act after you. You're not going to meet your RFE target. So yeah, that's a problem. If they are aware, then you need to basically open a range that allows you to defend optimally to their 3-betting. Now to do this, we're going to do this in future. We're going to go into this more in future when we talk about facing 3-bets. But for now, there'll be a minimum defense frequency for you when you're on the button of around 45% of your range you're going to want to be defending. And what this does is it actually makes villain indifferent. It stops him from massively exceeding, or even exceeding at all, his own RFE target when he 3-bets you. He'll have his required equity target just as you will when you open. He'll have one for his 3-betting. So when you fold just over half your range, not much over, 5% over half your range, you're kind of making him indifferent there to bluffing you because of the price, the adjusted RFE he's going to have on his 3-bet, and that's why. We'll go into the math of this in future and talk about why that's a good benchmark starting point for a minimum defense frequency after you open button and face a 3-bet. So being aware, when villain is aware, it's problematic because if we start to open a range that makes us fold way more than that minimum safe defense frequency against the 3-bet, his 3-bets become insanely profitable, and all he has to do to start really making a lot of money against us, and whenever our opponent profits, we suffer. That's how it works. PokerStars is not giving him money, saying, well done, pat on the back, here's $10 for playing well. It's us that money's coming from if we open too wide and have to fold too much to 3-bets. We're giving him a direct route to just killing us in that respect. So it's okay if you think your opponent's a mega net, you can open 4 deuce off, blind versus blind, and expect him never to adjust to you. That's great. Just make the more unaware your opponent is, the closer vacuum EV runs with long-term EV, basically. I'm going to get into that in just a minute, what long-term EV means exactly. So against nits, against really tight, brainless regs playing way too many tables, against passive fish who just fold and stuff, don't worry about it. Don't worry about long-term EV. Just play a hand in a vacuum and just make it. If a steal is profitable, it's going to work enough that one time in isolation, do it, because there's no long-term repercussion. He's not going to exploit you. If, however, your villain is skilled, aware, just a standard reg at any meaningful stake, these days at online 6max cash, you need to give that a bit of respect, and you need to probably not open 100% in the small blind, because you're just going to get killed. Especially out of position. You can get away with more abuse on the button, because at least you have position, you can defend a lot of even a weak range to a 3-bet. Blind versus blind, you really can't. You're just going to be suffering a lot there, so you have to tighten up considerably in the small blind. So I've spoken about RFE and meeting it. I want to talk now about how you actually estimate whether you meet it or not mathematically. When I open the button and I have 2 players stacked after me, there is a combined fold percentage of both of those players, which is equal to the percentage that player A folds multiplied by the percentage that player B folds. This is called combined probability, and it comes up in poker and in math and in life all the time. You toss 3 coins, you want them all to be heads. The probability of that is 1 in 2 times 1 in 2 times 1 in 2, or 1 in 8, or 12.5%. That's the chances of all 3 coins being heads. That will only happen about 1 in 8 times, or exactly 1 in 8 times. Know about it, if you follow me. So in poker, the same thing happens. If villain A folds 80% and villain B folds 80% as well, they both fold 64% of the time. I think I discussed this last time actually, so I won't spend loads of time on it. But the shortcut here is to just basically know your times tables from high school or primary school. And, if one folds 60, one folds 50, they both fold 30. 6 by 5 is 30. Just simplify it like that. So that's RFE, that's how we adjust RFE, that's how we decide if we can meet RFE, know how much to adjust it by, whether we can open or not. But this is the final piece of the puzzle, is this long-term EV thing. You need to have a good idea how often your opponent is actually going to be folding in a vacuum to know whether to open, but you also need to have an idea how likely he is to exploit your range if you create a really unbalanced, weak opening range yourself. Again, worse being out of position than being in position. Long-term EV is basically the amount of EV your strategy makes over a continued amount, a lot of hands, basically. So when I open 8-4 in the button, I might say, okay, these 2 guys are quite tight, but they are aware. I'm making money right now, but do I lose more money by missing out on all those future steals than I would make by opening that hand? That is one big problem. Is future long-term EV going to be worse for you and is it going to outweigh the gain you made in a vacuum? If it's only slightly plus EV to open 8-4 offsuit, but that hand goes towards hurting your long-term strategy, don't do it. Similarly, if you need to open 40% of hands to have a balanced strategy, don't open one that's like only the top 48%, because you have 40% of more suitable hands available for you. Don't wait around. You're not in a tournament. You can wait around. You don't have to basically just play a hand because you're going to get blinded out or because of the dynamic. If you're playing like Zoom, Cash, don't do that. Like, don't open a hand that's 46% just because, oh well, I've not been active recently. No one cares. No one's been at your table. You don't have an image. None of these like fluid exploitative factors exist in Zoom until you have a dynamic or you get placed a lot with someone in quick succession, which can happen in smaller pools, where Zoom begins to play a bit more like regular. Anyway, so that's how we do it. That's how we think about opening. Opening is incredibly important for all of those reasons. There's one other thing I would say about things like Zoom and stuff like that. Like, if you are playing in a pool where people are at your table and they're hitting fold and they're accumulating, HUD data on you, even though they've not seen with their eyes physically what you've done, then that's bad as well for you being unbalanced. Like, don't open 85% just by default there unless you think the population is insanely unaware nits that are never going to do anything about it. Some populations are like that. Most aren't. 5NL Zoom, yeah, okay, you can probably get away with that kind of shit. You probably can't get away with that in 25NL at all. So yeah, they're building up HUD data, and they are going to reach a point where they just look at you and they say, oh look, button open stat, 85%, I 3-bet insanely wide, he can't do anything about it, and they kill you for it. So That's it. There is long-term EV to think about as well. But hopefully that helps next time you're contemplating a button steal. Are you likely to meet your adjusted required fold equity based on all those factors that you can adjust it by, the skill of your opponents, how much fold equity you have after the flop, how often they 3-bet you, how good your hand is, how much frequent strength it has, these kind of things. Or is the hand going to fall short of adjusted RFV and be a minus AV open? Or is it, like I say, going to be a plus AV open in a vacuum? That's a bad idea long term because it involves you playing a range you just can't defend and are going to get exploited by playing because your opponents are aware. That's been quite a rant on opening in the last 2 podcasts, and that's basically the end of that section. Next week we're going to move on to chapter 2 of the book, which is all about isolating, which is about raising preflop when someone's limped. The chapter is actually called When Someone's Limped, and we introduce the ISO raise, when we want the ISO, what factors we consider, how it's different, why it's much more dynamic than opening, and what we need to think about. We're not going to build default ranges for isolating next week. We're going to talk about the factors and look at each spot on an individual basis. Anyway, this has been Characters for Grinder School, and I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Hope you're going to enjoy this series. I'm certainly looking forward to getting stuck in with another 20 episodes or so. Might take some breaks in between for student interviews or something. But anyway, please keep your feedback coming to admin@carrotcorner.com. Let me know what you think. Get in touch. What else would you like to see in the podcast? What could I do more of, less of? Are you interested in private coaching? If so, hit me up. We can talk. Admin@carrotcorner.com is my email. My site is carrotcorner.com. And yeah, that's basically it for this week. And yeah, see you guys on the next one. And bye for now.
Little girl, send shivers down my spine. One thought of you damn knocks me